So if anybody knows me, I don't really do politics. And when I say I don't do politics, it's not that I don't know anything about politics, and it's not that I just avoid it. It's just I don't like talking about it with certain people because people get too emotional. People get too, and I get it, politics is a big thing. It affects a lot of people's lives in it. So I get that people like get a bit emotional by it, yeah. But if I'm trying to bring another point of view in it, I don't like it when people start shouting at me, bro. I'm cool. It annoys me. But anyway, that being said, yeah, there's a lot going on in the world right now, and it sounds like cool. Let me make this video in it to just give some thoughts, you get me? So before I start in it, obviously qualifications and stuff ain't important, but just to start, you get me? I got 2 degrees in politics, 1 in politics BA, 1 in political economy, you get me? And I worked in like different kind of like jobs with like regulators and stuff like that. So you get me? I know politics relatively well. Used to work at university as well. I used to run a lot of events at Edinburgh University for their politics and international relations department in it. So you get me? I used to chat with the academics a lot. So anyway, with all of that being said, yeah, there's all this stuff going on, yeah, with Iran and Israel, yeah. I want to give a couple of thoughts on it. So firstly, yeah, it's an interesting one. That's what I'm gonna say, because I think for me, the way I kind of look at this issue right now is like I look at it from the perspective of a political economist. You get me? So when I say that, I basically just mean I kind of like try and sort of incorporate the sort of political and economic impact of this thing together. So what I try and do is I try and kind of like understand the ramifications of people's actions, and I try and understand not necessarily the intentions as such, but kind of like what is it that they're trying to do, and can they get it done, and what will be the spillover effects of what they're doing. So with that being said, Jem, obviously there's a lot of issue right now with the oil prices, things like that. There's a lot of issues in terms of instability. There's a lot of different countries kind of like starting to sort of like stake a claim in different kinds of areas and things like that. Some stuff with China and Taiwan. There's some stuff with like Egypt mobilizing. There's some stuff with Turkey mobilizing potentially against Cyprus and Israel and all this kind of stuff. So it's a very interesting time. A very, very interesting time indeed. Obviously, there's the whole Ukraine-Russia war, etc., etc. With all of that being said, yeah, I believe that a lot of this stuff here, if we look at the sort of like supply side impact of this, so when I say supply side impact, what I mean is essentially the impact of these policies and these behaviors and these wars in terms of how it impacts the way people actually consume, or the way a producer will provide a product for the market. You can kind of see some interesting parallels. So what happens is that when we speak about supply side impacts, we kind of speak about what this kind of like impacts in terms of how people produce different kinds of things, how that can impact policies, how that can impact governments, how that can impact the day-to-day person on an everyday level. And I think with a lot of this stuff happening, if the oil price keeps going, so as of right now, it's surged to about $32 per barrel in Europe. If it keeps going, I think this is going to sound crazy, but this is a really good thing, but it doesn't sound like it's a good thing. I think it's going to crash the market. I think it's going to crash the global economy, because oil, we're not as dependent as we used to be, obviously because of like the Russia war and the sanctions on Russia, that's kind of limiting oil production. And obviously the sanctions on Iran is limiting oil production. But obviously the sanctions are being lifted in the sanctions on Venezuela as well. So all of these things were kind of like sort of weaning people off of oil. But obviously people are trying to consume more oil now because of like AI kind of like using a lot of more energy. So we need a lot more energy to kind of be used to kind of grow the economy, all this kind of stuff. So with that being said, yeah, this kind of like dependence on oil, even though it's less dependent, I think this dependence on oil and the price going up so high is going to crash the economy, especially in terms of like travel and things like that, because obviously trains run on oil, cars run on oil, planes run on oil, ships run on oil. So if all of these kind of like places where we travel run on oil and the price of oil goes up, then that means that basically kind of just doing anything in terms of an economic kind of impact is going to be so expensive that a lot of companies are going to go out of business. And in order for them to not go out of business, they're going to have to cut costs. And if they need to cut costs, They can do this in a multitude of ways. But one of the ways that is very obvious right now is artificial intelligence. So if you kind of use AI chatbots instead of employing people, all this kind of stuff, you can kind of reduce your numbers of employees, which can reduce the cost of actually running a business. And as we're seeing kind of like in terms of the UK, we're seeing that the government are raising taxes on businesses. They're raising the minimum wage as well. So basically what happens is that when you raise the minimum wage, it makes it more expensive for businesses to hire new employees, and because it makes it more expensive, it means that they can't hire new employees, so all this kind of stuff in it. So all of this kind of stuff is essentially kind of like supply side shocks. So with all of this being said, I think a lot of these supply side shocks is basically just going to sort of create a rapid movement towards kind of like modernization of the world. So essentially kind of like what we call Industry 4.0. So I've spoken about this before, but Industry 4.0 is basically kind of like this next phase of the Industrial Revolution. So basically Industrial Revolution is kind of like when the world changes, when things kind of like get a bit more sophisticated. So Industry 4.0 is kind of like this next movement, and it started around like 2019, 2020, QR codes, AI, electric cars, all this kind of stuff, working from home. All of this stuff is kind of like Industry 4.0, but it's kind of like, so for example, the World Economic Forum have this thing called the Agenda 2030, which is basically kind of like the goal is to kind of get all of the global economies ready for the next phase of the Industrial Revolution by 2030. So I think kind of like through this war, and through kind of like the surge in oil prices, and through kind of essentially kind of like crashing the economy, especially with all these governments kind of like making it harder for business to operate, this is going to kind of rapidly increase and incentivize the market to adopt these new technologies and these new kind of like ways of doing things. Because what happens is that a lot of the time, so I'm going to go to someone else. So this guy called Joseph Schumpeter, and he talks about this thing called creative destruction. And creative destruction is basically kind of essentially in an economy, you have old players. So basically people who are like very sort of like have been there for a very long time, and they don't really want to give up power. So what happens is that sometimes an economy has to crash and things have to burn in order for the old players to be moved out of the market so that the new players can come in. So what's happening now is that basically they're trying to get the old players out of the market so that we can get new players coming in. Or if the old players don't want to leave, then they need to adjust. So you've seen all the stuff with like cryptocurrency and the banks and everything else as well. All of this stuff is all linked to kind of like essentially kind of creative destruction, creating a space that will allow for new innovative businesses, entrepreneurs, things like that to come in and actually kind of like take advantage of these new technologies and these new opportunities and these new frontiers. So a lot of the time we kind of see economic crashes and things like that as kind of like a negative thing. But if you're kind of looking at it long term, and if you're looking at sort of like in terms of like technological development and improvement and kind of just making this world a bit more quick, you can see this as a good thing. So to summarize, I've said a lot of stuff and I know your head's probably hurting. So to summarize, what I'm saying today is this war, we might have our reasons, we might have our intentions. Obviously, we know that it's to do with kind of like they say Armageddon, religious stuff, and obviously the Al-Aqsa Mosque, obviously Gaza. We have all of these kind of reasons on the surface, but then when we look at kind of like these reasons in context with kind of like economics, so kind of if we look at sort of like these kind of like Armageddon kind of like explanations in context of the supply side shock impacts on the economic level, you can kind of say that there's a suggestion or implication that these things are all kind of like trying to sort of usher us into a new state of the world, a new era, a new society. So I think that's the kind of neat answer for why everything is happening right now. I think it is about trying to sort of instigate and incentivize and shift the world into a new phase. And some people have disagreements on how to do this. Some people have questions and challenges on this stuff. So that's how we get these clashes. But the clash is actually kind of what will actually propel us into that new phase, if that makes sense. So yeah, anyway, that's all I have to say. Have a great day.